Locusta, Nero's chief poisoner, assassin of emperors, and mushroom fanatic. By looking into her class, design, skill set, backstory, and characterization, how well does the Locusta of Fate Grand Order compare to her historical counterpart? And what grade would I give her depiction? Let's do this. Locusta is an assassin class servant, which is one of those no-brainer decisions that speaks for itself. There's no other class I'd choose for Locusta. Well, that was easy. Getting into her character design, Locusta, to be perfectly honest, I've had some trouble approaching this one. Artistic depictions of Locusta are few and far between, certainly compared to her two employers. But they generally depict a modest-looking woman dressed up in robes, someone who you wouldn't suspect of being a master poisoner. Fate took a different approach. The best I can come up with is that Locusta kinda looks like a sage, a mystic, a fortune teller, something along those lines. Mushrooms and the color purple are particularly prominent, which does make sense since purple is often associated with poison, and mushrooms, well, we will get back to that later. But really, there isn't much for me to say about this design other than that it's a work of creative license. As I said though, there aren't very many depictions of Locusta out there, so I'm less fussy about this than I usually would be. Still, Locusta strikes me less as an alchemist or poisoner, and more like she's some kind of kooky spiritual type. The kooky certainly fits her FGO character. But, as I said, this is a work of creative license, rather than being based on historical interpretations of Locusta. Moving into her skill set, Locusta's first skill is poison mixing, which is a pretty obvious skill for her to have. Locusta was extremely knowledgeable on the effects of various herbs, and she used that knowledge to make a living for herself, by selling poisons to the rich and powerful in Rome, who were always looking for a discreet way to kill their rivals. Locusta was so good at this that, actually, I'll just save this for the backstory section. My point is, this is a great skill for Locusta. Locusta's second skill is Toughness Poison, a generic skill with a new addition to it. Toughness on its own is a skill meant to represent someone who has maintained good health, or who is never wounded. The poison addition to this skill is obviously a link to Locusta, but to be honest, I'm not sure why she has this skill. There's no entry for this skill in her profile, so I can only guess what the developers meant by giving her this. But looking at what the skill actually does, allowing Locusta to heal when she is poisoned, I guess that could make sense for the reasons I talked about with her first skill. That she was a master herbalist who understood what each plant could do, and so it makes sense that, if Locusta found herself being poisoned, then she probably could figure out a way to counteract that. Maybe that's what the devs were going for here? Your guess is as good as mine. Lastly, Locusta's third skill is Cooking Mushroom, which represents Locusta's skill in cooking, with a particular focus on mushrooms. While I already talked about Locusta's skill with herbs and brewing potions, she wasn't actually known for being a good cook. Though, if you know the effects of mixing various herbs together, I guess it logically makes sense that you might also know how to mix other ingredients together to get a desired result. That's just my supposition though. But mushrooms, well, if you know anything about Locusta's character in FGO, then you know that she's absolutely crazy about mushrooms. She brings them up about as often as Phantom brings up Christine, or Tesla and Edison fighting over their respective currents. So what's the deal? Was the Locusta from history also a mushroom fanatic? Well, no, but mushrooms did play a role in arguably the most important assassination she ever did. And that leads us to... Locusta's noble phantasm is Finis Fungus, whereupon she floats up into the air, throws a bunch of mushrooms into a boiling cauldron, and then pours it upon her enemy, drowning them in poison. Finis Fungus means the end of the mushroom, or something like that. In Latin, finis means the end, while fungus is mushroom. Anyway, the most important murder Locusta ever conducted was the assassination of Emperor Claudius in 54 CE, at the behest of his wife, Agrippina the Younger. Obviously, assassinating the ruler of the mightiest empire on Earth isn't easy. So how did Locusta do it? Well, her idea was to poison Claudius's food, but he had a taster that would test the food for poison, so the taster had to be taken care of first, given something that would cause the taster to have some bathroom adventures. Next was to poison Claudius's food itself, but there was a catch. Claudius kept a long feather nearby whenever he ate something. If Claudius suspected that the food was poisoned, he would put the feather down his throat, forcing himself to vomit the food up. Locusta's solution to this was fairly simple: soak the feather in poison as well. Now, what was the food that Claudius was eating? The food that Locusta poisoned? Mushrooms, with some thinking that deathcap mushrooms specifically were the culprit. This is the only part of Locusta's legend that involves mushrooms. But since this is literally the assassination of a Roman emperor, it is kind of a big deal. It's just that, well, fate kinda took the mushroom thing and ran with it. So while mushrooms do play a role in Locusta's legend, much of her fate characterization surrounding mushrooms is an invention of the franchise. Locusta also has a second noble phantasm brought up during Lilim Harlot, Finis Veninum Nero. This is a special poison Locusta placed into a golden box and gave to Nero while he was fleeing Rome, something for Nero to use in order to take his own life. In Fate, this poison is described as being painless, and it likely would have been as such in real life too, we don't know for sure. However, both in Fate and in real life, Nero did not use this poison, instead using a blade. That Nero chose to die painfully instead of using Locusta's poison, well, let's just say that Locusta didn't take it very well. This is actually used as the reason why Locusta has turned out to be so kooky as a servant. The knowledge that her beloved emperor had died painfully in such a miserable way, it drove her mad. And so we end up with the mushroom obsession and a host of other quirky behaviors. Now, does this work? Kinda. I'll dig into this more in the backstory section, but it's not a stretch to say that the historical Locusta probably had a positive opinion of Nero, since it was through his patronage that Locusta reached the heights of her wealth and status. It also got her killed, but we will get back to that later. Locusta's craft essence is Food Offering for the Gods, depicting a fancy silver plate covered in food, mostly of the mushroom variety, of course. At first I thought there wouldn't be much for me to say about this CE, since it talks about mushrooms, and, well, I've already talked about the mushrooms. But the CE's text adds a little tidbit, about Locusta calling her mushrooms sacred food offerings, and that this is a joke relating to Nero. This is actually something from the historical record, since it is said that Nero called mushrooms the food of the gods shortly after the death of Claudius. It's kind of a dark joke, and a hint that Nero knew about the murder. Also mentioned is a line saying that her father became a god after consuming mushrooms, followed by psychotic laughter. Since Claudius died from eating poisoned mushrooms, and that Claudius was deified by Nero in the Senate shortly following his death, you could say that Claudius did become a god after eating mushrooms. This is some very dark humor, but it's a great link to history. Looking into the future, Locusta's Valentines CE it's not much, but depicting what looks like a cake covered in... Okay, we get it. Locusta is a mushroom fanatic. Well, at least she's consistent. Anyway, let's move on. Now for characterization, starting with a look into the legends surrounding Locusta. Now, there is a reason I chose to do a video on Locusta immediately after my 2 videos on Nero and Draco, and that's because much of Locusta's story ties directly into Nero's. After all, I already mentioned her role in the assassination of Emperor Claudius, Nero's adopted father, whose death allowed Nero to become the 5th emperor of Rome. Indeed, most of what we know about Locusta is tied to Nero. There are very few details outside of that. So what do we know about her? We know almost nothing about Locusta's early life. She is said to have been from Gaul, modern-day France, but this isn't entirely certain, nor is her birth date. But if she was from Gaul, it clearly would have been well after Caesar's conquest. And so whether or not Locusta was Gallic or a descendant of the Romans, I'm not sure. Either way, she wasn't born into privilege. I've even heard some sources claim that she was a slave. But what is clear is that, at some point during her youth, Locusta became a master in both the properties of herbs and how to mix them into poisons. And if you know anything about Roman politics, you know that murder was a pretty popular method of dealing with one's enemies. But since a sword through the head is a bit lacking in deniability, the nobility of Rome tended to prefer more discreet methods, like poison. Seeing a way to make a living off of her talents, Locusta moved to Rome, choosing to sell her poisons to those willing to pay. For a low-born woman from Gaul, there probably weren't too many options, and selling poison to the rich and powerful could certainly be lucrative. She was basically a mercenary killer, working for whoever could afford her prices. I've heard some go so far as to call her a serial killer, but I think mercenary is a better fit. However, since murder is still illegal, at some point Locusta ended up getting caught, and she was thrown in jail. That might have been the end for Locusta, but her skill at poisoning had gotten her a bit of notoriety, and it attracted the attention of someone who was looking for just such a talent, the Empress Agrippina the Younger. Agrippina, of course, was looking to kill her husband, Emperor Claudius, so that her son Nero could ascend to the throne, and to do so before Claudius's son from a previous marriage, Britannicus, could come of age. So Agrippina found Locusta in prison and decided to recruit her. How that went, well, I already went into detail about that when talking about Locusta's MP, that she poisoned Claudius's food taster, then his mushrooms, and then the feather Claudius used to induce vomiting if he suspected poison. Despite the success of this assassination, Locusta seems to have remained in jail afterwards. She probably couldn't be let out right away, since that would have confirmed not only Agrippina's involvement in Claudius's death, but who had helped Agrippina do it. However, one person who seemed to know about that involvement, but didn't care, was the new emperor, Nero. And Nero had his own problems that needed sorting, problems that could use a good poisoner to take care of. So a few months later in 55 CE, Nero approached Locusta and asked her about ways to dispatch his adopted brother, Britannicus, to ensure that he could never grow up to be a threat to Nero's reign. But since Britannicus was only 13, well, Locusta's first idea was to give him something slow-acting, something that would take time to work, but also be less suspicious. The trouble is, the poison didn't work, so Nero beat Locusta up, threatening her if she didn't provide a quicker, more deadly poison, consequences be damned. In response, Locusta gave Nero what he was asking for, but this murder still needed a bit of finesse. Like his father, Britannicus had a taster check his stuff beforehand. Think about that for a second. A 13-year-old had a taster to check for poisons. Ancient Rome was pretty messed up. Anyway, Britannicus was brought a hot drink at a dinner party, which the taster tested out first. But Britannicus thought the drink was too hot, and so wanted to have it cooled down a bit. This was done with some water, but this is when the poison was added. Upon drinking it, Britannicus promptly fell ill, with Nero claiming that he was having an epileptic seizure. Before long, Britannicus was dead, though the circumstances and the speed at which Nero held the funeral ended up tipping people off that Britannicus was probably poisoned. Nevertheless, Nero was the emperor, and so got away with it. Unlike his mother, Agrippina, Nero didn't forget to reward Locusta for her services. Not only did he release her from jail, Nero gave her large estates to live on, as well as sending convicted criminals whom Locusta could test her poisons on. Lovely. Nero even sent Locusta pupils to study under her, effectively creating a school for poisoners. After many years of trying to earn a living through her talents, Locusta had hit the jackpot, the favor of the most powerful man in the known world. We don't know much about what Locusta was up to for the next 13 years of Nero's reign, only that she reappears again during its collapse in 68 CE, the story I mentioned earlier about how she provided Nero a poison to use when he was fleeing Rome, though he ultimately did not take it. After Nero's death and the succession of Galba, Locusta was seen as being a part of Nero's inner circle, and her involvement in the deaths of Claudius and Britannicus had long been suspected. And since she had become identified with Nero, Galba decided to have Locusta executed a few months later in 69 CE. Now, there are some very lurid stories about how Locusta was executed, one of which involves a giraffe, and let's just say that it is not YouTube friendly. And while the Romans were known for conducting executions that can only be described as cruel and unusual, it's more likely Locusta was killed in a more conventional way. But what we do know is that Locusta's reputation persisted. Indeed, she actually gets a mention in the Count of Monte Cristo. Chapter 101 is literally named Locusta, because a character from that book who deals in poisons is directly compared to Locusta. For someone who presumably started out as a low-born woman from Gaul, helping to assassinate one Roman emperor, then to work for his successor, Locusta certainly has a story worth remembering. So how does fate decide to portray Locusta? Well, we first meet her in Lilim Harlot, where she pops in to rescue the protagonist and Draco early in the story. Two things are made clear quite quickly. Locusta remains fiercely loyal to Nero, and by extension Draco, and that she is a complete nutter obsessed with mushrooms. I've already talked about the mushroom thing, so there is little more for me to add there. And since I've just gone through Locusta's backstory, you know that she basically reached the highest point of her life while working for Nero, even if we don't have any real details about it. All we know is that from the time after Britannicus' murder to Nero's fall, a period of 13 years, Locusta was doing well, having achieved the patronage of Rome's emperor. So portraying Locusta as being loyal to Nero does make sense to me. She might have started out as a mercenary poisoner, but once Locusta got Nero's favor, she stuck with him until the very end. And that ending actually plays a major role in why Locusta is turned into such a goofball. Because, going back to her second MP, you may remember that Locusta gave Nero a special dose of poison when Nero was fleeing Rome, only for Nero to end up not taking it. That Nero chose to die painfully, rather than taking Locusta's special poison, this is explained as being not only the reason why the servant Locusta has become so unhinged, but correcting that fate is Locusta's primary motivation. Locusta's wish is that, this time, Draco has a more peaceful ending than Nero had in life. That Draco uses Locusta's poison rather than a blade to end her own life. In other words, while she first appears to Draco and the protagonist as an ally, Locusta is actually the floor guardian of the second singularity, turning against the party near the end of the story. But Locusta makes two miscalculations. First is that she misunderstands Draco, and why Draco might not want to take Locusta's poison. The reason why Nero didn't take Locusta's poison in life is that Nero's life had been full of poison already, and she didn't want to end it that way. This is even more true of Fate's Nero than it is for the historical Nero, since it is then revealed that, in the Fate original story about how Nero's mother Agrippina had been poisoning Nero from an early age, Locusta had been forced to help Agrippina do it, something that Locusta felt immense guilt over. This is, of course, an invention of the Fate franchise, something I talked about in my video on Nero. So obviously, Locusta being the one to provide Agrippina the poison that afflicted Nero is also a creation of the Fate franchise. Since Locusta's whole life was about poison, she could only offer Nero poison, to offer Nero something that, at the end of her life, Nero wanted to escape from, and that was the reason why she chose the blade. The second miscalculation is that Locusta herself was being used by the Incarnadines. Her genuine affection for Nero, and by extension Draco, was being used to break down the final barrier that prevented the Incarnadines from taking Draco's body over, to become the new Beast 6. Since Locusta was fixated upon her wish, she had no inkling that she was just a pawn for the true villain of Lilim Harlot. It very nearly gets Locusta killed, but she gets rescued, some words are said, and Locusta recognizes her mistakes, resolving to help the protagonist and others to save Draco and defeat the Incarnadine demons. Because while Locusta had wanted to give Nero a peaceful end, she realized that what she truly wants is for Nero to keep on living, to continue shining brightly for all to see. And while it might be as servants rather than as living humans, it appears that Locusta's wish is being granted. Lilim Harlot is, of course, Locusta's most important story appearance, and I don't know of any additional major story appearances she might have in the future. But, to be honest, she doesn't really need more than that to flesh out her character. Lilim Harlot did a great job at that. But just because Locusta isn't likely to get any more major story appearances, that doesn't mean that we won't see her again. Indeed, my procrastination in working on this video actually ended up being a blessing in disguise, because Locusta makes a brief appearance in Summer 8, which is still ongoing at the time of writing. She is predictably up to some mushroom-related shenanigans involving Chloe, only to be dealt with by the protagonist and Nero. It's a brief appearance, but it's the sort of thing we are likely to get more of in the future. After all, Locusta is a goofball. And her connection to one of the Fate franchise's most popular characters ensures that, if the writers get an excuse to bring Nero into a story, chances are Locusta is also coming along for the ride. And now for the verdict. What grade would I give Locusta's depiction in Fate Grand Order? Well, if I had to sum it up, it's that Locusta is a blend of the historical and stuff original to the Fate franchise. Her backstory, skills, and the parts of her characterization connected to them, those are all really good. On the other hand, her outlandish design, the mushroom obsession, and her links to story bits original to Fate are obvious hits to her accuracy. But I can't be too upset about this because, if you haven't picked up on it by now, we don't actually know very much about Locusta. The things we do know, that she was a master poisoner who worked for Nero, that she was involved in some high-profile murders, we get all of that in FGO, but that's not quite enough to work with. And so the Fate writers threw in some new stuff, like the mushroom shenanigans or her role in poisoning Nero while she was growing up. Things that, while not true to history, at least are either connected to the real history, or are good from a storytelling perspective. Locusta's portrayal may have some obvious embellishments, but at its core, it's still a pretty good depiction of the character. And so for a final grade, I am going to give Locusta, the Assassin of Emperors, a B. If you would like to learn more about another character infamous for her use of poison, check out my video on Medea here. Also please like, subscribe, and come check out the streams during the weekend sometime, starting at around 3 p.m. Pacific here on YouTube. Until next time.